Bible is full of stories that we all know and love. But how well do we know them? The answer might surprise you. The Bible you thought you knew is going to dive deep into the exquisite details of the biblical stories that make them fascinating and transforming. Last week we dealt with the strange story in which the Israelite God incited David to number Israel and Judah. This was because God was angry. God seems to have wanted a general census, but David ended up counting only soldiers. Afterwards, God was upset at David and punished Israel. A similar story is recounted in 1 Chronicles chapter 21. But the differences are startling. This is part 1 of that story. In this version, Satan incites David to number Israel. That's in verse 1. Right off the bat, commentary is required. This is because Satan is, in effect, a new character. The Old Testament does not have a developed idea that evil derives from satanic forces. This is why there are instances when the Israelite God sometimes seems capable of evil. A couple of examples suffice to make the point. When David is anointed in 1 Samuel 16, God's Spirit leaves Saul and embraces David. That's in verses 13 and 14 of chapter 16 of 1 Samuel. But that is not the only thing that happened. When God's Spirit departed Saul, its place was taken by an evil spirit of the Lord, which subsequently tormented Saul from time to time. In 1 Kings 22, there is a story in which God sent a lying spirit to confound the king's prophets. This lying spirit induced the prophets to lure the Israelite king into battle, where he would be consequently killed as per God's plan. In both instances, God is depicted as so sovereign that even evil, at least of some kind, can be attributed to the deity. In time, monotheism created a theological difficulty. That is, if there was only one God, and if that God was good and loving, then how can one account for the existence of evil in the world? Before long, the thought was developed that evil could be attributed to demonic sources. Before long, Satan, a word that means adversary in Hebrew, became a candidate for that role. Interestingly, Hasatan, the Satan, or the adversary, does appear before such ideas about evil emerge. But that Satan is not actually a demonic force. For example, in the prologue to the book of Job, the Satan, or the adversary, appears as a member of God's court. The other members are referred to as B'nai HaElohim, sons of God. These are God's minions. At no time is this figure, the adversary, called evil or diabolical or demonic or some such. The figure is part of God's court, does only what God commands or allows him to do, and acts according to God's initiative. This is scarcely the personification of evil. The figure in 1 Chronicles 21 is a different character. He is no longer Hasatan, the Satan, or the adversary. Now he is simply Satan without the definite article. It's as though it's now a name. Because the author of this material could not conceive of the Israelite God doing anything evil, he has Satan doing the inciting. We do not know whether this author knew the version we treated in last week's podcast, but it is a similar enough story that both are worth comparing. And in this account, the Lord is off the hook, so to speak. In the 1 Chronicles passage, Satan stood up against Israel and ordered David to number Israel. It is not clear what upset Satan. It is also not clear why numbering Israel would be considered a judgment of sorts. Also, in this case, only Israel is to be numbered. In 2 Samuel 24, Israel and Judah were to be numbered. Like the episode in 2 Samuel, David asks Joab, the military officer, to carry out this task. David wants the census to cover Israel from the extreme south, Beersheba, to the extreme north, Dan. King David wants Joab to report to him after the count. This is verse 2. As in Samuel, Joab objects. Joab's objection in Chronicles seems to have something to do with determining levels of loyalty or even citizenship. Joab asks, rhetorically, whether or not all of Israel make up my Lord's servants, obviously meaning the king. In that light, Joab cannot figure out what is to be gained by numbering the people. David's orders, however, prevailed. So Joab counted Israel. There is no mention of the time this took, as was the case in the passage in Samuel. And then he returned to Jerusalem with the count. Even though in this instance David did not ask Joab to confine the count to fighting men, those are the only Israelites mentioned when Joab gives the count to David. 1,100,000 men who drew the sword in Israel, and in Judah 470,000 who drew the sword. All of a sudden, Judah has been counted, even though only Israel was mentioned at first. Then we are told about another difference in this count. Joab did not do a census of Levi and Benjamin, because Joab was appalled that he had been asked to do this. That's in verse 6. So far, the differences between the two accounts are: 1. Satan, not God, does the inciting. 2. It is Israel that Satan wants counting, though Israel and Judah are tallied together. 3. Joab strenuously objects to the numbering, though why is unclear. 4. This time, David does not change the command by asking Joab to count only troops. 5. No time frame is mentioned in Chronicles. 6. Though there was no command to count troops, only soldiers, people who wield swords, are counted when the number is reported to David. 7. The numbers are much larger in Chronicles. 8. Finally, in Chronicles, the tribes of Levi and Benjamin are not included in the count. In verse 7, we are told that God was displeased and hit Israel hard. God was displeased with the counting. David immediately confesses that he had, quote-unquote, done this thing, though what he had done wrong is unclear. David goes on to ask for divine forgiveness in verse 8. God responds by means of the prophet Gad, David's seer. Gad is to present David with alternatives for punishment. That's in verse 10. The options Gad presents are: 1, 3 years of famine; 2, 3 years of devastation at the hand of Israel's enemies, in which case the enemies' swords will overtake Israel; and 3 days in which the Lord will wield a sword, resulting in pestilence throughout the land, and the angel of the Lord going on a destructive romp throughout the land. That's in verse 12. David decided on option 3. His rationale was that the Lord would end up being much more merciful than his enemies. Somehow, the famine seemed not to be much of a factor, even though surely suffering for 3 days at the Lord's hand would certainly have been preferable to 3 years of famine. But that is only a supposition. In any case, the Lord honors David's choice. When the pestilence came, 70,000 in Israel fell, the same number of casualties as in 2 Samuel 24. At that point, the Lord sent the angel to destroy Jerusalem. But before the angel was able to carry out this mission, the Lord repented for ordering Jerusalem's destruction and told the angel to stop. That's in verse 15. When this happened, the angel was standing by the threshing floor of a Jebusite man who was named Ornan. This man was named Araunah in 2 Samuel. Before going on, we need to rehearse the possible reasons why doing a census of Israel was so problematic, especially when the count is being ordered by the king. One possibility is that a count of the population was necessary for the levying of taxes. That is, counting the people meant that a tax hike was on the way. A second possibility is that a census would help the king know how many able bodies were available for the labor force. Israelites were conscripted for labor during Solomon's reign. Perhaps that was not unique to Solomon's time in office. A third possibility is that a census would provide figures that a king would find helpful for conscripting an army. Was it either incidental or accidental that in both the Samuel and Chronicles accounts, only soldiers were mentioned in the count? However, even if one or all of these factors were involved in taking Israel's census, at best that is an inference. The story is frustratingly vague about why taking a census was such a big deal. In any case, when the Lord repented and told the angel to desist, simultaneously David saw the angel standing with a drawn sword about to wield the weapon against Jerusalem. David and several elders donned sackcloth in response, indicating a lamenting gesture, and they fell on their faces and implored God. It seems that God's repenting was at the same time a function of divine initiative and responding to David's and the elders' blandishments. David took the responsibility for the whole affair. He admitted that he had ordered the census, effectively conceding that he had done what Satan wanted. Because he was the one at fault, though, he did not think that Israel itself should be punished. He agreed that he had acted wickedly, but insisted that Israel, called in this instance these sheep, had done nothing wrong. David then asked God to reserve divine judgment on him and my father's house, but no longer let the plague harm the Israelite people. God's changing the divine mind and David's prayer did the trick. The plague ceased. At this juncture, the angel of the Lord commanded Gad to tell David that he was to build an altar. We will treat that segment of the story next week. For now, let's reflect, at least in a preliminary way, on the differences of these two accounts. First off, the differences between material in Samuel Kings and Chronicles are hardly unprecedented in the Bible. Some people have referred to these differences to an Old Testament version of the so-called synoptic problem. The synoptic problem involves the differences one encounters in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. If one includes the Gospel of John, the problem, if that is what it is, expands. This is because the details of these accounts do not mesh. Folk who are uneasy with this biblical phenomenon solve the issue by harmonizing the details. Of course, by doing that, it is an admission that there is something wrong with the Gospels as we have them and that they need to be corrected. Plus, Harmonizing creates a text that no one ever wrote and no one ever read. Also, I've not even mentioned the mental gymnastics required to harmonize the material. A harmony of the Gospels was never canonized. Instead, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were canonized. Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles were canonized. Each has its own perspective, a perspective that is not only blurred, but sometimes completely erased by so-called harmonization. Some of these differences are somewhat minor, but others are substantial. For example, in the Synoptics, Jesus changes the money changers out of the Jerusalem temple at the end of his ministry, whereas in the Gospel of John, he does this at the beginning of his ministry. That's in John chapter 2, verses 13 and following. Regardless, each gospel needs to be permitted to arrange the material in a manner that accents the points it wants to make. Secondly, these differences are only problematic if one insists on seeing this material as historical in essence. When one reads the Bible as history, one is no longer reading it as Scripture. History is about what happened in the past, which may or may not be relevant to the present. To the contrary, reading the Bible as Scripture is always oriented to the present and the future. Instead of adjusting, so to speak, the material in 2 Samuel 24 and 1 Chronicles 21 so that any contradictions are eliminated, our first task is to allow each of the chapters to address the community of faith as Scripture. We will elaborate on that further in next week's podcast. For now, let me encourage you to go to my website, faspina.com. Let me know what your email is so that I can contact you when we're ready for our mini courses. And also, if you have a question that you'd like me to address in a future Q&A session, email me at fspina106@gmail.com. Thanks. I want to thank you so very much for listening to The Bible You Thought You Knew. I have a question for you. Do you have a question or topic that you'd like me to cover on the podcast? If so, all you need to do is head over to Apple Podcasts and do two simple things. One, leave a rating and review telling me what you think of the podcast. Two, in that review, ask anything you want related to the Bible. That's all you have to do. Then, listen in to hear your question answered on a future episode. Join us next time on The Bible You Thought You Knew when we discuss Jesus' personal Bible. God bless.